jingle, 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 jingle bells, jingle, 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 jingle bells, jingle, 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 jingle bells, jingle, jingle bells, jingle, jingle bells. Feliz Navidad, Happy Christmas and Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, Feliz Navidad, Happy Christmas and Kwanzaa, Feliz Navidad. Jingle, 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 jingle bells, jingle, jingle bells, jingle, jingle bells. Feliz Navidad, Happy Christmas and Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, 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 jingle, jingle bells, jingle, jingle bells, jingle, jingle, jingle bells, jingle, jingle bells, jingle, jingle bells, jingle, 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 jingle bells, jingle, jingle bells.
Friends, here's a wonderful Christmas gift for anyone who smokes. Because it says, Merry Christmas and Happy Smoking 200 times. Yes, 10 packs of those better-tasting Luckies, all done up for Christmas in a beautiful carton, created just for Lucky Strike by the famous designer, Mr. Raymond Loewy. It'll look so bright and colorful under your Christmas tree, and it's such a welcome gift to anyone who enjoys a good smoke.
Bleeding. Are you sure you're all right? What you... My mouth's bleeding, Bert! My mouth's bleeding! Zuzu's pedals! Zuzu... There they are! Bert! What do you know about that? Merry Christmas! Well, Merry Christmas! Merry! Merry!
Just what we need. Another movie.
Yay!
Time was, film was a serious thing. Theater and photography were still recent history. Celluloid was queen. Bombastic acting and sculpted cinematography was the law of the land. Trade wars were fought by diplomats wanting to wheedle their ways into the grooves of foreign film markets, and men made mad by 30-second ads wouldn't touch television with a 10-foot boom pole for fear of compromising their own effortless brilliance. Conservatism used to rule when independent was code for inferior, but breathless vandals sacked the gates and staged a revolution. After a while, anyone from anywhere could make a movie about anything. If it wasn't New York or LA, your town used to only make a cameo in major motion pictures as a secondary stump town. But new lines of power turned the lens on a city near you. Films, better fit for dumpsters than theaters, capitalized and sold audiences fantasies about far-flung utopias.
Creating havoc, the police were nowhere to be found. About an hour after that, the group was back in action.
But for us to have to close our stores during the peak season, the holiday Christmas season just beginning, really is an injustice.
Every morning they drive to work and they wonder why there's gridlock, right? But this is what I've been working on. If you had a train, right, a super train, you give the people a good reason to get out of their cars, you give them great coffee, great music, they will park and ride.
I don't even know him. I am having all of these fantasies about some man I have never even met who lives in Seattle.
See, here's the key. Okay. Try not to make too many long-distance phone calls, all right?
Thanks again, man. This is really good of you.
Hey, you're doing me a favor, too.
Thank you.
All right, take it easy. All right, knock him dead. They're already dead in Seattle.
But the Cedar Hills landfill, as well as the lifestyles that make it a necessity, haven't gone anywhere. Northgate Mall, Bellevue Square, and University Village are still standing as of this writing.
Yes, film is a trashy medium now, and the next 90 minutes won't help much. As shelves and video stores across the country groan under the weight of more and more films made by more and more producers, we have to wonder how excess came to be a fact of life in the United States. Few films focus on the matter, but the matter is complex. It involves fads in film, fashion, and food that we discard, cultural styles never built to last, wants confused with needs, tools built to break, castaway products, and sleight-of-hand techniques designed to distance people from production. Sometime at the beginning of the 20th century, landfills were a pet project of progressive-era reformers. Disease, filth, and poverty in major cities like Seattle went hand in hand, so that municipal do-gooders imagined unseen landfills hidden from a rapidly increasing populace as part of the moral uplift of society. The idea went over a little too well. About a dozen dumps dotted Seattle's landscapes until a filthy trinity of stench, vermin, and toxic air spurred citizen resistance. King County's last dump opened in Cedar Hills, Issaquah in 1971 and is slated to shut down in the next decade when the county's waste will become a completely privatized affair. Lucky for us, Cedar Hills will have already left behind a lifetime of memories. On the drive out to the landfill, you pass by seldom seen urban niceties, like a Darigold processing plant. Nature greets you on the drive before any of the trash you'd expect, and you find yourself forgetting you are on the way to a wasteland. An intensifying smell breaks the trance of a tranquil hour's drive from Seattle, and at long last you arrive at your destination, the dump. A designated tour guide named, no joke, Wally, welcomes you aboard a Blue County van to explore the wreck. You drive through mountains of garbage, 2 generations of waste, compacted, shelved, and molded into hills replete with grass colored a sickly shade of spring green. Gunky runoff from the still unseen garbage is drained by sewers and piped away to a wastewater treatment facility. The garbage water has to be kept bubbling, or it'd become a breeding ground for disease. The drive continues to reveal deer who frolic obliviously, processing plants that suck away gases from refuse and convert them to energy, castaway mattresses laid on new plots of sand soon to be taken up by garbage you still haven't seen yet. You wonder if it was all a rumor. The beat goes on. An average of 5,000 tons of trash a day finds its way here, and by the smell of it, you see exactly why neighbors of the Phil have lobbied to have it shut down. Seagulls, ravens, and no less than bald eagles circle over the open dump of contemporary trash processed by men with bloodshot eyes and tractors. They used to use pyrotechnics to keep the birds away, but hired hunters instead when it was pointed out that it wasn't exactly wise to use fireworks in air with such a high content of methane. Wally tells you incredible stories about the kinds of things that have happened here. Everything from homeless men to orphan children found in the tippers that pack new rubbish on top of old, policemen conducting investigations with impossible hopes of finding specific pieces of evidence, sentimental families asking about lost photo albums, evicted residents hurrying to the scene to salvage possessions that were shipped out before they were. By now, the stench is unbearable, if unforgettable, and you can't help but recall that smell is the sense tied closest to memory. All civilizations leave behind ruins, it's true, but few, if any others, have had as much means to make a past soaked in waste serve the future. Maybe it's fitting that the national mascot collects in droves here, searching the past for the future, and searching the waste for energy.
How our city turns trash to treasure. Seattle Post-Intelligencer, January 25th, 2010. Our lifestyles make renewable power a necessity now. As part of a 20-year commitment announced last week, Seattle agreed to continue shipping 400,000 tons of garbage a year to local landfills that turn our trash's noxious gases into energy for sale to Seattle City Light. America's waste problem is now a sustainable solution.
Well, what leaps out at me is that somebody once said that the genius of modern industrial capitalism really lies in its ability to take the problems generated by industrial capitalism and see them as exciting new business opportunities. And I sort of see the whole waste to energy enthusiasm that we're currently experiencing as part of that, right? We have this tremendous waste problem, and yet rather than really using that to rethink the way we organize our lives and our society and our social worlds and our material worlds, what we do is seize on the possibility of, a new, exciting new industry.
In the 1940s and 50s, the city began to confront what they called a garbage crisis. And they were running out of landfill space, and besides, the landfill was not a very good neighbor. So people were more than happy to see them paved over and put to a different use. So Seattle had to find someplace else to ship its garbage. And now I understand they ship it to rural King County and even eastern Oregon.
Fittingly named, Washington is a symbol for the entire country. 42nd state and a state of mind. Part urban, but mostly rural, with highways crisscrossing terrain seized centuries ago in bloody warfare with the Nez Perce tribe. This is, in fact, the Wild Wild West valorized by an entire genre of film. But if you're coming from Seattle, you travel east, in the direction of Tri-Cities, Hanford Nuclear Reservation, and Waste Management's epic landfill in Central Oregon, to see the secrets of life in advanced industrial societies. Somewhere near Yakima lies a crossroad of the human experience. The spot where Kennewick Man's ancient remains were found lies in ground long since contaminated by nuclear waste from Hanford. It wouldn't be a stretch to say humanity's ancestors went to sleep in sand and woke up to the looming possibility of the species' suicide. Nearby, wind farms with obelisks well-suited for a sci-fi flick stand like monuments over irrigation projects siphoning life into exhausted land. Horses graze, the air smells quite literally of bullshit, and unperturbed hills stand idly by. On the one hand, time seems to stand still here. On the other hand, well, a clock has two hands. Time ticks away.
Well, the theme of your project is a waste of time, and the only thing I could perhaps add to your theme is that, of course, when European and Americans arrived in the Northwest, there was just complete abundance. I mean, the forests were endless, the fish runs were endless, the coal was available. So the culture of burn it, consume it was easily transplanted to the Northwest.
Once upon a time in America, livestock were transportation. Pain medicine was a luxury, but old wives' tales were concocted by women who sewed their own clothes. Made in Japan meant junk. Railroads may as well have been made in China. After its maiden voyage, the Titanic didn't arrive, nor had such a thing as American popular taste. The French told us what culture was and why we didn't have it. The Irish, Italians, and Jews weren't white yet. A nation was being born of every other nationality, and the idea of a black president in the White House was as far flung as that of a black resident on the right side of Main Street. Popular entertainers blackened their faces to sell tickets. The coal they did it with was king, oil an unruly subject. Electricity was still an experiment, and landfills were a necessary amenity of a self-respecting society. Environmentalists were eugenicists who equated strains of trees and racial stock. Beaches looked like nunneries, and national parks, by and large, were still just an idea, far from the best one in an era that burns timber to heat homes. The just recently United States in the generation after the Civil War. Big, populous, and energetic. Over the course of a tumultuous century, everything it came to be known for was synonymous with shrinking distance and bulging appetites. George Washington, Crispus Attucks, Betsy Ross, and the rest had their place in the pantheon, but as one journalist put it, Henry Ford was the first American. Decades before style sold Americans what they didn't need, Ford's first automobiles reflected the still rural society from which they emerged. Quaint, affordable, drawn to scale, and slow. Any color they want, Ford once remarked, as long as it's black. At the turn of the century, the hazardous traffic of dark, speeding metal navigated the metropolitan night without the miracle of illuminated streets. When local luminary J.D. Ross took the helm of Seattle City Light, he was among the brightest lights the young city had ever seen. And he did more than anyone to bolster Seattle's reputation as an environmental utopia. Tapping rivers in the Skagit Valley and dams in eastern Washington, Ross honed power to light Seattle's streets. It was a feat of public engineering matched only by the fluidation of Los Angeles. Seattle City Light was the first municipally owned utility company in the United States. The self-proclaimed spark of the best-lit city in America. By the numbers, the 20th century began in 1900, but it wasn't until the end of the Great War that the United States emerged as a self-assured industrial power. Increasingly urban, America gradually separated from its agricultural beginnings. Riding the high of wartime excess, factories, mills, textiles, and plants operated with more testosterone than ever. The nation was on the road towards finishing in the 20th century what the automobile heralded at the end of the 19th.
Mankind reinvents the wheel. Detroit Free Press, November 12, 1918. Only those of us as busy with studying history as we are with making it can guess for certain what great liberatory power the automobile might reap in this young antebellum period. If our own recent past with the railroad after the tragic Civil War is any indication, we can look forward to the sudden nearness of hitherto hidden countrymen, and to the increased enlightenment that can only come from a nation that dares nature in order to crisscross history's ramparts. The question will be whether we come to know ourselves better for reinventing the wheel and making it serve mammon, or whether Ford's four wheels are a sad substitute for the cosmic cycles which govern vitality, the sun, the moon, the earth, the stars, and all between them, and the rhythm of all human activity, boom or bust, past and present. The engines of economic growth might be combustible indeed, as might be the growth of economic engines. War or peace, we might yet return to where we started, dumber and number for having driven so far to gain so little, exhausted by production, tired of power, slowed by speed, wasted by luxuries, prosperous but poor, intelligently trivial, and made old and weary by incessant newness. More is the rule in an age of less.
Though America in the 19-teens had become increasingly self-reliant, the psychoanalytic fad was taking hold in Europe. America imported books for popular consumption with titles like 10,000 Dreams Interpreted, The Psychology of Selling Life Insurance, and The Art of Controlling Minds. Emerging national brands reached for wallets via the psyches of their audience. Shame had been used to sell war bonds during the Great War.
So you do start to see very harsh ads in the 1920s that are designed to raise people's level of insecurity. There's some very famous ones. The first antiperspirant or deodorant that's introduced, Odorono, in the 1920s, uses these sort of harsh techniques to sort of make people fear that maybe others are avoiding them because, you know, they smell, something that an advertiser would not have done in the pre-World War I period.
Any product released after the Great War was a carefully workshopped commodity passed through an assembly line of psychiatrists, consumer guinea pigs, and admin. No technique had more clout for marketers than concepts like cool and authenticity. The Roaring '20s appear to us today as a time of reckless abandon. But most Americans in this tenuous post-war economy were as concerned as ever. College education, home ownership, early matrimony, and steady income were their principal preoccupations. The 1920s enjoy a reputation which the also conservative 50s don't. Playing up the excesses of the decade makes the subsequent depression seem like an anomaly. Consumer fetishism in an age engaged with Freud knew many faces. To those in northern cities, Southerners in their uncomplicated squalor appeared to have life figured out. European Americans at the time were fascinated with the idea of their own repressions and could make African American life a symbol of escape from responsibility. Any consumer of American popular culture bought hackneyed stereotypes when they bought records, tickets to films, and radios. Starting in the late 20s, the most popular radio show in America was Amos and Andy, so that commoditized typecasts came through loud and clear, even over sheets of static. In fact, commoditized typecasts came through loud and clear with the help of white sheets and static. Radio, along with the automobile and the phonograph, was instrumental in forming American consumer culture. Nationalized and subsidized during World War I, GE and United Fruit Company banded together after the war to create the Radio Corporation of America. FM radio was on its way when a consumer workshop successfully identified the sound of a glass of water being poured. Political and theatrical dramas played out through radio speakers to captivated audiences in even the most remote regions of the country. Advertisements tantalized a nation into buying more homes, more cars, indeed, more radios. Jazz instrumentals, crafted dialogue, and well-rehearsed, disembodied voices thrilled the public. In the generation before television, the ear, and not the eye, was still the target, which might explain why so few saw the Great Depression coming.
Speculation can't squander Christmas cash flow. New York Times, November 29, 1929. Say it from the mountaintops in this 1,929th year since the birth of our Savior, and the first month since gambling men made mints of large fortunes on Wall Street. Jesus may have been born in a manger on this December 25th, but he died that you mightn't suffer life without a Model T and a new radiola.
When it was up to FDR to revive an American economy in shambles, he tried executive orders urging representatives to move Thanksgiving Day back a week, so as to extend the holiday shopping season. The resolutions were practically laughed out of the House on 3 separate occasions. Congress and history have looked more kindly on Roosevelt's attempts to end the Depression through environmental stimuli of one kind or another.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, so help me God. Our greatest primary task is to put people to work, but at the same time, through this employment, accomplishing greatly needed projects to stimulate and reorganize the use of our great natural resources. Yes, the task can be helped by national planning for all forms of transportation and of communications and other utilities that have a definitely public character. But it can never be helped by merely talking about it.
And the public power movement was up and running when Franklin Roosevelt came on the scene, first as governor of New York and then as president. And in fact, J.D. Ross was recruited by Roosevelt away from the city of Seattle, first to participate in the Securities and Exchange Commission because of his familiarity with bonds and funding and that sort of thing, and then as the first head of the Bonneville Power Authority, which became the Bonneville Power Administration.
The New Deal institutes a host of programs to try to help farmers, to control erosion, to manage water better, to give technical advice on crops. Most of those measures are still in place in one way or another.
What a time the 20s were. Ponzi schemes and real estate sold unseen homes and bridges. Shares of stock were as easy to come by as toilet paper, and, to meet popular taste, the Ford Company begrudgingly started issuing Model Ts in more than the obligatory all-black everything. More people were leaving the countryside for the city and its factories, its box houses, and its colleges. But then again, the countryside was still responsible for feeding everyone. The pressures of feeding a nation of individuals that didn't grow their own food anymore forced farmers to overexert the topsoil. From Oklahoma to Oregon, West Virginia to Washington, the waste of formerly arable land was stirred by winding winds. Oases of American agriculture were claimed overnight by the traveling desert. Millions of human lives disrupted by a creeping smog of sand, eroded soil, ground granite, and the overturned graves of 1 billion dead bison and their bones. Most towns blew in the wind, but regions like eastern Washington and the Tennessee Valley that had access to nearby waterways found a way out of the doldrums. Federal public works projects harnessed great rivers with the same resolve that cowboys did their cattle. Dams such as Grand Coulee, Priest Rapids, and Bonneville made life livable again in towns like Yakima, Hanford, and Spokane. Bridge to Nowhere was originally used to describe Grand Coulee. Critics attacked it as a project of more size, but no more usefulness than Egypt's pyramids. The truth was that agriculture and irrigation were revived, and the Alcoa Corporation found a use for Washington's cheap power. Washington in the early 40s produced 40% of the country's aluminum to go along with 40% of its hydroelectric power. If the war against the Dust Bowl had been won in eastern Washington, Grand Coulee would power America past the Second Global One by powering the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in 1945.
Time measured in megatons. Time Magazine, January 26, 1951. Whole suburbs, fake and real, have found themselves established to partake in demolition. Two test sites and facilities in Hanford, Washington, and Alamogordo, New Mexico. A salute. Countdown to a test blast in Yucca Valley, Nevada begins Sunday, at dawn, in the desert, on the sands of time.
From dust bowls to dropping nuclear weapons on itself and others, America emerged an uncontested global superpower after World War II. The golden age of American consumerism followed.
From the instant of that first blast until Hiroshima vanished from the list of living cities, closely guarded plants in New Mexico, Tennessee, and the state of Washington continued their work to shorten the war.
On August 6, 1945, a Boeing plane manufactured in Seattle dropped atomic weapons with plutonium manufactured at Hanford on Japan. American productive forces were running at full tilt to satisfy the tremendous material demands of clothing, feeding, transporting, sheltering, and arming thousands of troops in Asia and Europe. Companies like Alcoa, DuPont, Boeing, and United Fruit were left with excess. More cotton, more food, more planes, more metals.
The frontiers of the future are not on any map.
Man-made materials found new applications during the war. Plastics, previously used only sparingly in the creation of radios, were used in the windshields of thousands of bomber planes. Derivatives of chemicals used in bombs themselves found new applications in the agricultural sector.
Also, after World War II, we found that we had a lot of factories that weren't being put to use. So all the factories that used to produce apparel for the military wear and for parachutes and things like that, they all were left empty. So companies would buy those over, and we would try to find ways to make materials cheaper and more affordable. And so we started to produce at a very large scale.
The productivity of the industry increases so dramatically, both in plastics and in chemicals would be the other example during World War II, that once the war ends, those industries face a potential crisis because they don't really have a peacetime market. They're really pretty new industries, and they've expanded dramatically during the war. So then the question is, how can they convert this to a peacetime product that can be sold on the civilian market once the war military market dries up, essentially? And both the plastics industry and the chemical industry go to work on that immediately. Before the war is over, they are thinking of ways to market their products to civilians. And so that's why you get, DDT flooding the marketplace really in 1945, and similarly with plastics. You get plastics being introduced into all different kinds of aspects of life, beginning again right in 1945, and you see plastics just continue to expand over the next, really down to the present day. The uses are multiplied.
Today, industry in this country is spending over $200 million a year to improve old products and develop new products, which mean new industries, new jobs.
First pumped reluctantly in Pennsylvania at the tail end of the 19th century, petroleum in particular fueled America's post-war rise. It started taking on more value in the 20s with the coming of the automobile, but it was as demonized as the intrepid tycoons that drilled for it.
15 years after Commissioner Ellsworth's gloomy predictions, Edwin Drake surprised skeptics by pumping petroleum out of the hills of Pennsylvania. For years, the oilmen cursed gasoline. It was a troublesome byproduct, and they dumped millions of gallons of it into the rivers and streams. Then, science discovered that gasoline was liquid horsepower.
A conglomeration of American and British oil companies, including Texaco, Shell, and British Petroleum, were nicknamed the Seven Sisters. Their powerful DC lobby pushed American policymakers to forbid the nationalization of oil in countries as far-flung as Venezuela and Kuwait, and to further the domestic uses of oil where it was necessary, and especially where it wasn't.
Look at just a few things created by scientific research in laboratories operated by the oil companies of America, byproducts of petroleum from which have sprung up entirely new industries. Face cream for the ladies, special tasteless waxes for certain kinds of candies, wax for sealing letters, soap, fertilizers for the farmers, Coke, ink, streets and highways.
America starts producing petroleum seriously in the 1920s, and that's what allows the auto industry to take off in the way it does. If petroleum had been a scarce resource or hard to come by, there's no way that this sort of envisioning could have occurred. So I would say automobiles certainly don't drive suburbanization, automobiles certainly don't drive suburbanization, but they're a necessary factor for that post-war suburbanization. Without automobiles and cheap petroleum, we never could have had the kind of development that we did have.
In the Eisenhower 50s, the Chamber of Commerce placed sparsely populated suburbs at the center of federal attention. Middle-class subsidies like the FHA put homes within reach of the average 20-something, while the GI Bill institutionalized the role of the male breadwinner. An explosion in housing that hadn't been seen since the 20s was deliberately coupled with home-delivered propaganda, magazines that tied female liberation to the family budget and household appliances. Highways were pipelines from home to work to nearby supermarkets and back to home. All the while, the invention of the shopping mall perfected the science of inducing spending with in-store techniques designed to bewilder consumers into a buying frenzy and to sentimentalize simple acts of consumption.
World's tallest Christmas tree found at Northgate Mall. Life magazine, December 11th, 1950. Each Christmas, Washington and Oregon put out an old civic battle cry, "Our tree's bigger than yours." This year, the competition has been won by Seattle's 78-store shopping center, Northgate. Opened only as early as April, eager housewives on a Yuletide panic scurry in the giant shadow, stopping only briefly to admire. As a final indignity, the tree's branches were shorn off, and those of other firs were nailed to its now impotent trunk.
The 50s brought the rise of lifestyle capitalism. Not the simple purchase of this appliance or that foodstuff, but the consumption of a cornucopia of goods reflecting the character of the buyer. A couch was a house, was a spouse. Commodities belonged to constellations, like the stars on the flag of a nation that introduced the consumer credit card in the 50s, so that families could start running the same kinds of deficits governments always had to win wars. The Cold War was a force behind efforts to create a nation of consumers. Documentaries produced by the American Petroleum Institute, DuPont, and GE, often featuring the narration of a young Ronald Reagan, went about reconstructing the past to serve the present. Newsreels and Saturday morning cartoons omitted that America was a nation of farmers and makers for most of its history, insisted that capitalism and democracy were identical, and professed that oil and competition were the strength of the country.
It wasn't so long ago in the history of man's voyage toward a better world that ships were carrying eager passengers toward the shores of a new nation that was just in the building. Our forefathers were constructing the foundation of this nation by interlocking inseparably the blocks of our political and economic freedoms.
And of course we know that's true if we look at any elementary history book. We know that many of the sort of foundational acts of the American Revolution were really consumer acts, right? The Boston Tea Party, etc. So you can argue that there are elements of our current society that can be dated back at least a couple of centuries, if not more. But what is different, I think, is that even though people were engaged in a consumer economy, they didn't see their ideas primarily as consumers. That is, even though American colonists engaged in acts of what we might call consumer resistance, they were doing that less as consumers than as citizens, right? Or as that, as citizens of the British Empire, right? They were engaged in a set of political identities that I think could not be reduced or even equated with consumer identities as we currently understand them.
But what could be more American than highways, automobiles, and fast food? Months after the end of the Korean War, Seattle saw the birth of a local restaurant that would grow to be a community institution. Dick's mimicked Ford's assembly line techniques and the rapid-fire production of Boeing bomber planes. Each location was deliberately placed in residential areas and flanked by sizable parking lots, but no tables. Like the highways and suburbs they've come to signify, hamburgers were practically a public works project. Hamburgers crumble back into ground beef if not soothed by a certain percentage of lard, from a cow or otherwise. USDA codes require the fat come from cattle. An influential beef lobby in Washington, D.C. thus ensured a monopoly on the $99 billion served at McDonald's and McDonald's mini-me's into the next millennium. Although the company insisted taste had been the difference since 1954, Dick's was conceptually a carbon copy of other fast food restaurants that made a national symbol of hamburgers. Arby's in Ohio and Sonic Hamburgers in Oklahoma City, among others, went into business glorifying a lifestyle born when nuclear weapons threatened to stop time. At a time when everybody's talking about the good old days, let's talk about the good old days. It was the 1950s when the name White Castle may as well have been a cruel pun, and Johnny Rockets was best friends with Jim Crow. Suburbs from Wallingford, Washington to Levittown, New York were founded as FHA loans, and restrictive housing covenants systematically excluded prospective black and brown homebuyers from lily-white Pleasantvilles. At the heart of it all was a suburban boom, built not as much on meritocracy and innovation as on the mythical seductive quality of white skin and more speculation. The go-go 50s bore witness to 4 separate recessions, another war, and the continued denial of civil rights to American blacks and American women. Lifestyle capitalism was at full throttle. Telebeamed images completed the work that film started and radio resisted, readied a younger generation to turn on, tune in, buy more. To say nothing of the generation that knew nothing but TV. TV was revolutionary to those who had only known radio. The grammar of consumption changed. Knowledge became decoupled from speech, literacy, and words. Images and photographs displaced words and well-crafted paragraphs that had reigned on radio and in the theater. In the 21st century, when so much else is privatized, we can appreciate TV for privatizing what used to be a community experience in theater and cinema. Movie houses were suddenly more obsolete, like yesterday's car or yesterday's women. Jingles are old-fashioned now because the eye takes in more information than the ear ever could. Advertisers, starting in the 50s, seized on the facts of nature, giving us more appearances to aspire to. Slogans that cut to the chase. The fewer words, the better. Why didn't the lives we saw around us look like the lives of those we saw on TV? Buy until it all matches. Eat until it hurts. Play with the future. Independence is happiness. The beginning of tomorrow is now. A civilized way to take out your aggression. Obey your thirst. Just do it. Taste the difference. Come to where the flavor is. I'm loving it. A little different like you. The only way to go. Don't let life pass you by. What's on your list today? We're the company you keep. Dude, you're getting Adele. It's what's for dinner. Be all you can be, but certainly not more. Live better. This is where amazing happens. Yes, we can. It keeps on going and going and going and going and
Its tingling paste tells you it's working. Getting your teeth cleaner. Whiter, whiter, whiter.
Cleans everything like a white tornado.
Change up the beep soup up.
The incredible new low-priced Polaroid land camera for black and white pictures. Whiteness is the security McLean's gives.
And they buy it from either this pump or this one.
A miracle of modern science, TV debuted at the New York World's Fair of 1940, a showcase of consumer goods designed to get Americans back into stores during the Depression. By the 1960s, television was commonplace, as technology delivered a ton of innovations in a decade dubbed the Age of Aquarius. The laser, the LED screen, the ATM and tape cassette, the computer mouse, AstroTurf, the pacemaker. Edible toothpicks, iron-on buttons, a teletext TV that printed visuals from the screen, transparent aerosol cans, and the US military's short-lived Rocketeer belt all went the way of the dodo in the decade. Still, The World's Fair was a consumer novelty, starting with one that left Seattle with the Space Needle in 1962 and continuing with bicentennial celebrations in the 70s. At New York's second World's Fair in 1964, held not in dense Manhattan, but in sprawling Queens County, where Queens Plaza Mall was built as part of the festivities, the washer-dryer combo and the Videophone were debuted, along with a well-intentioned 100% plastic high heel that bloodied feet across the country. Filmmaker Stanley Kubrick visited the fair in 1964, and as a result was inspired to dream of life in 2001. History lives because we'll always fight for a keener perspective on the present. The popular tomorrows we consume in books, movies, and TV shows are valued for the bird's-eye view they give us on our own lives today, while the rest seems uninteresting and irrelevant, at least until catastrophe or crisis force us back into their shadow. Be it the Empire State Building in 1933, or the Space Needle in 1962, the American tendency in times of great optimism or depression is to scrape the skies and tug on history's heights. From up this high, trouble can be seen a continent away, and bad times are better anticipated. The 60s were a pinnacle, not because the world was suddenly fair, or all its problems solved, but because a greater society seemed more within reach than ever, and we had the sense that we could see over the heads of our obstacles. The future was now. What government, corporate power, and greedy citizens took from the past and present with one hand, they gave to the future with the other. We had a million uses for a handful of non-renewable resources, but suddenly, in cities from Seattle to Atlanta, public transportation became a civic rallying cry and symbol of environmental awareness. The automobile's reign was uncontested, but traders spoke of a bicycle boom in the late 60s. It was already clear that petroleum reserves had numbered days, but then again, media made it seem a matter of months before companies figured out how to channel microwaves and nuclear for constructive purposes. We'd been propagandized to support capitalism uncritically, but sci-fi arts warned what we'd look like in the light of the future.
When sci-fi first took off was, in the 50s during nuclear scares and, sort of the beginning of the height of the Cold War, and a lot of science fiction then was cautionary. Like, these are the things that could go wrong if these current ills are ever brought to their extreme, and then a lot of them were focusing on space, focusing on, building utopias in places that we can't even imagine yet.
An Odyssey you ought to miss. New York Times, April 5th, 1968. While technology today moves at the speed of light, Kubrick's lens would rather focus on drying paint. If the ever-quickening cycles of newness and obsolescence hold such a dull future, we'd do better to quit running in cycles now and take up with Kubrick's apes in their caves.
Starting the late 60s, Seattle earned a national reputation as a kind of city of the future. Call it a mix between the optimism of sci-fi and the sentimentality of the Western. National representations of the city's World's Fair, coupled with story after story about a peaceful, sleepy, urban utopia with more trees than you could shake a branch at. Soon, everyone in the country knew about the public market on Pike Street and the wired new coffee company called Starbucks. In 1969, Perry Como crooned, "The bluest skies you've ever seen were in a city notorious for aluminum gray skies." Shortly after, one historian wrote that Seattle was a great place to live because it's a great place to buy things. Northern cities like Seattle produced textiles, machines, and automobiles during the golden age of American consumption. By the end of the decade, a change you could count was afoot. Companies with no allegiance to state or region gradually relocated to the American South, or left the country altogether for cheaper energy, cheaper land, and cheaper labor. Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Cleveland started to look more like Wild West ghost towns. Myths about better places out west circulated, while jobs evaporated. Normally, during times of high unemployment, the currency consumers use to buy goods is more reliable, credit harder to come by for banks and families alike. But in the early 70s, America was pouring oil, blood, bombs, and metal into Vietnam. More money was printed to pay for it all. Stagnation combined with inflation to produce stagflation. The phenomenon was as ugly as the word invented to describe it. Fewer people could buy things on account of record unemployment, and the currency they bought things with was in any case weaker on account of wartime inflation. The domestic effects of war, stagnating wages, and unemployment might have made life hellish enough in the 70s. The troubles were made worse by a couple of international developments. For one, increasing economic competition. Germany and Japan had finally re-industrialized after the devastation of World War II, and did so partially on the strength of their automotive industries. At the marketplace, it wasn't a contest. American consumers turned out to have no more allegiance to America than the companies they patronized. Fords rusted. Bikes, rollerblades, and skateboards fell into fashion, as did wearing sweaters indoors when the OPEC oil crisis hit. Starting the 50s, America bought more oil from others than it could produce for itself, usually from countries it had tenuous relationships with. For supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, a group of petroleum-exporting countries in the Middle East instituted an embargo. Already expensive domestic goods were made even more expensive, since petroleum was used at every stage of the production, circulation, and consumption of every commodity, including oil itself. The end to a golden age of consumption was spelled by naked fact after naked fact. If the 60s were the decade when America lost its innocence, the 70s were when it discovered masturbation. Male breadwinner roles declined as deindustrialization led to a breakdown in the traditional suburban family structure. At any rate, houses in suburbs were less affordable. Americans began to slowly trickle back to cities, beginning a demographic shift known as gentrification. In those cities, porn theaters and strip clubs were the place where the dominance of the American male could be performed for a consuming audience. Porn had always existed in one form or another, but prevailing standards of decency in the 20th century kept it from being consumed openly. At the precise moment that more and more women were finding empowerment in the workplace, and not just as domesticated managers of family budgets, pornography films were doing their best to objectify them as nothing more than sex objects. Along with the growing popularity of macabre motion pictures, Americans in what one historian called the Age of Narcissism couldn't look away from screens that depicted their own dissolution. Slasher films for a nation at war, zombie pictures for a country that seemed dead on its feet, corn for a suddenly impotent industrial behemoth.
And in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation.
When President Jimmy Carter addressed the nation on July 15, 1979, he was pissed. It wasn't enough that the Federal Energy Administration had been founded 9 years earlier, that Vietnam was a memory, or that government had already begun reverse propagandizing the population into conservation. Carter presumed to identify a more general, spiritual malaise that he termed a crisis of confidence.
But just as we are losing our confidence in the future, we are also beginning to close the door on our past. In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption.
In the tortured, honest, poorly delivered speech, Carter ripped into the deflated national character for 40 minutes. He decried what he called the golden calf of consumption and laid out an ambitious program to achieve complete energy self-sufficiency in the second term that eluded him. If Kennedy the Northerner had symbolized the optimism of a decade in his slick performance debating Nixon in 1960, Carter, the desperate-looking Southerner, told viewers weaned on the grammar of TV all they needed to know about America's 70s with his body language, to say nothing of his Sunbelt twang.
This is not a message of happiness or reassurance, but it is the truth, and it is a warning.
America in the stagflated 70s might have been in search of its soul, but it would take oil if it could find it. The Federal Energy Administration released public service announcements detailing the extent of America's energy debacle and the great lengths that it would go to solve it.
The prospect of big strikes on this continent appear remote. Some geologists claim that the world's greatest fossil fuel resources lie beneath ocean waters, in the North Sea, off Indonesia, in the Gulf of Mexico, off the eastern seaboard. But underwater drilling is expensive and risky. Floating platforms are towed out to sea and anchored. Drilling rigs are assembled on them at great cost, and bits are sent 9,000 to 10,000 feet and more deep into the ocean floor.
This PSA was from 1975. It's been said that the United States does the right thing only after it has explored every other option. Limits, economies drawn to scale, and conservation had entered the American civic consciousness.
Well, just looking at my bills, I'm getting upset. Paying more for electricity every month, and the gasoline is going up, and I'm used to being able to go when I want to, but suddenly I think I'm going to have to start curbing my habits.
My family and I have tended to conserve energy, both in limiting the use of our cars, plus cut back on the heat in the home, less use of the air conditioner, and in general, a conservation ethics has come across our house.
What I've seen of people, most of them are pretty selfish. It's all right to let somebody else do it, but when it comes right down to home, why, they just want to go along the same old way.
can look back and sort of periodize 1945 to 1972, more or less. We could quibble on the dates, as this period where the American economy seems to be growing in what at the time people assumed to be an unproblematic way. Workers are doing better, more and more participation by more and more people in the consumer economy. By 1972, things are starting to shift, and you start to get deindustrialization in much of the old steel cities and the auto cities in the Midwest and parts of the East. And you start to see America being less economically competitive with many of the other nations in the world.
The Cold War slogged on through the Reagan 80s. The State Department's MO was to spend the Soviet military into the ground. Innovations from the 60s, like the mouse and LED, were engendered for more imaginative weapon systems in the 80s. By the 1990s, consumer electronics were the darling of American spenders, undergoing ever-tightening cycles of novelty and obsolescence, previously only seen in women's clothing. We seldom stop to think just how loaded the term fashion really is. It could seem that the styles and genres seen seasonally in so many walks of consumption are natural. The truth is, ever since Henry Ford begrudgingly turned his back on black, force-fed novelty and consumerism have gone hand in hand. Sometime during the Great Depression, the concept of planned obsolescence was introduced to marketers and big business. The idea was that by deliberately death-dating products to expire, consumers could be forced to become consumers again and again and again. Critical parts were to break down. Products were to be painted as undesirable with the advent of each update. In the rare event that an actual improvement in function was made, companies usually rationed out the advances, introducing gradual improvements yearly to string along an addicted clientele. The concept was adapted to every commodity, quietly at first, and then without a shred of subtlety. American auto companies in the Golden Age expressively created cars that would break down before the next presidential election. A loyal customer base was manufactured with more care than the vehicles that underwent no functional changes, but elaborate cosmetic ones. Big-bodied makes were swapped willy-nilly for bigger-bodied makes. Anything to use more steel, raise prices, and introduce more models. In the 50s, a famous refrigerator manufacturer and an auto company CEO both went on record saying that their ideal business model was the one practiced in the female fashion industry. In that field, tastemakers double as wastemakers. Annual fads are created with new designs and the manipulation of different fabrics to achieve novel aesthetics. Call it historical materialism. When the creative frontiers were exhausted, revamped retro styles could be introduced. Clothes make the man, but men made the clothing. Women were distant from the creative conception of goods, but were made to advertise them. Ad men in search of eye-catching optics copped out and opted for a pretty woman. Smiling faces and firm breasts have sold everything from cars to cameras to clothes themselves. When they manufactured bombers behind the scenes in the 40s, or during brief booms in the 80s and 90s, female consumers never made anywhere north of 75 cents for every male dollar, even as well-rehearsed money shots stared back at them from magazines they were expected to buy most of. The glass ceiling may as well have been a giant camera lens. Centralized male power in cinema has made everything from female directors to cinematographers to voice actors as unlikely as films without hoary gender stereotypes. Even as sustainability became a buzzword that encouraged Americans to limit waste, lowbrow representations of women's capabilities celebrated and encouraged the waste of their human potential. This was no more part of the national conversation than the burgeoning e-waste problem that began burdening landfills across the country with old monitors and modems in the heady Clinton years.
Seattle sounds of sleigh bells and cash registers. The Economist, November 29, 1999. A city better known in recent years for the torn dungarees and tortured bellows of the grunge fad, Seattle appears to have cleaned up quite nicely in time for the last holiday season of the 20th century. All about its rainy streets, one finds mint evidence of America's resurgent reign in the high-tech years of the Clinton era. When global leaders find themselves in the Pacific Northwest for a conference of the World Trade Organization this week, they'll scurry about sleepy streets with agitated holiday shoppers crowding Levi's, Nike Town, The Gap, and the like. If all goes according to schedule, cash registers, snapping cameras, and sleigh bells will replace grunge as music to the city's ears this December.
After World War II, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were flanked by the wreckage of 1 trillion megatons, political instability in all four corners and all 7 continents, and a wealth of untapped resources. The United States of America quickly went about rebuilding the world in its own image. Welfare packages were granted to European and Asian nations. Ambitious financial institutions, like the World Bank and IMF, extended seductive but costly loans to countries that resisted socialism. With the post-war period came a phase of expansion unseen since the sun set on the British Empire. Amateur historians and fire-breathing lefties alike adore Eisenhower for decrying the military-industrial complex. But the truth was that the violent foundation of American consumption was laid in the Eisenhower 50s. Politicians are fond of saying that democracies don't go to war with other democracies. A bolder lie was never told. In the 20th century, the United States deposed democratically elected leaders in nation after nation. Interventionism is a political football, but few question the projection of American power for more aluminum from Jamaica, more hamburger meat from Mexico, more oil from Venezuela, Nigeria, and the Middle East, more rubber from Liberia, more labor from India and China, more bitter fruit from the planet's banana republics. While Saturday morning cartoons cautioned kids against socialism, the Cold War turned hot in Afghanistan, Cuba, and Vietnam. Disorder was courted in the name of stability. War fought for the consumer. In December of 1999, domestically, consumers with a conscience spoke back in their own names, courted the same kind of disorder and disobedience normally reserved for third world settings, and disrupted the WTO to usher in a final, unhappy shopping season of the millennium. The origin of galaxies, planets, and life are epics. Human history seems a nasty, brutish short, depicting 1,000 decades of deep ignorance and early death. Grafting light from millennia of darkness and pleasures from evolutionary pains, we scratched the surface of our own potential, scraped the skies, philosophized, and mined the Earth's bounty for more and more. 24 frames a second, lapsed 1,000,000%, might be too fast to appreciate the distance we've traveled in such a short time. With progress slowed to snapshots, we get a better sense. Drinking blood from the skulls of our vanquished enemies used to be our favorite pastime. We'd kill food in competition with our bare hands. Hunt and gather the life out of environments that sustained us. And move on in search of greener pastures. An agricultural revolution came, and we learned to stay put. Nomads no more, those on the revolutionary vanguard forged families, kept to clans, remained true to tribes, and saw the nascence of nation-states. Freed from the daily distraction of foraging for food, humankind spun myths about the cosmos, made art, self-governed, and sailed the 7 seas in search of thicker plots to slash and burn. For thousands of years, animal muscle had to be the primary mover if people had work to do. An industrial revolution occurred when we tapped biofuels that incubated in secret in reserves. It was as if an entrepreneurial postgrad had suddenly discovered the family's voluptuous bank account and dared the riches on preposterous pet projects. Engines that could move themselves, invisible information sent through the air, man-made machines that mimicked the work of forces known only in nature. We're now living in the middle of that fabulous dissipation. Where the human family had formerly subsisted, it now flourished. Masqueraded as civilized in the wake of world wars, clothed cavemen in suits, and wondered all the while what had been left behind as former foragers and farmers. Historians and science fictionists wager whether industry would bankrupt the planet and force a grim reduction in living standards and population, or whether humans were mature enough to anticipate and avert scarcity in advance. From an agricultural revolution that saw us grow in pace with nature, to an industrial one that saw us use nature's tools to corral nature itself, the most dramatic revolution might be the one to come. The one that hyphenates humanity and nature in a more perfect union, authoring a 3-part revolutionary poem with verses themed agriculture, industry, and energy. New tools might be matched with new ideas, and old habits would die hard with a new wave of energy. Revolutions are part evolution and part revelation.
Call for energy on Consumer Holiday. Real Change News, November 26th, 2010. Black Friday, November 26th, 2010 begins the post-Thanksgiving consumer meltdown, countdown to the first Christmas of the young decade, and near 1-year anniversary of a troublesome story that broke last January about a problem plaguing Seattle's sewers. After the annual Gorge Fest that is Thanksgiving has passed, our gassy citizens might empathize with the town they call home, knowing that millions of dollars are monthly spent declogging pipelines, refitting manholes so they don't release methane, cleansing a sop cake of juicy refuse contributed by people who clog the municipality's collective arteries with oils, fats, and greases from their sinks and storm drains. In America, what you don't see is what you get. The secret costs and ingredients of our consumptive powerhouse are obscured by space and time, tucked away beyond municipal borders and landfills, hidden by history, or hidden again by more distance. Indeed, there was a time in the 20th century, before the transformative 70s, when consumptive patterns we today critique passed not simply as byproducts of the good life, but as the good life itself. To take up residency in poorly insulated single-family homes was a symbol of success, matched only by possession of the car you drove from there to work.
Excuse me, Mrs. Schwartz, could you tell us how you feel about oil heat?
Public power agencies across the country would come to your home and school you in the ways of using more oil heat, more gas, more electricity. In propaganda films narrated by the bossy chill of bureaucratic infallibility, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce would instruct you to help defeat the Soviets by taking more showers. The traditional symbols of power in America all have one degree of separation from the stress of excess, which includes oil spills, bulging landfills, and apparently clogged sewers. It's no wonder that so many see in the American dream only a series of nightmares, why so many dive in dumpsters proudly, live inoffensively and ineffectively in remote utopian communities, refuse to vote, and reserve an incapacitating, if well-meaning, distrust for the democratic process and for power politics.
It's refreshing. That's why things go better with Coke after Coke after Coke.
Institutional solutions we must call for, but this isn't so much a call for power as it is for energy. Because power is from without. It ensnares as it enables and addicts us, one barrel at a time. Energy, on the other hand, is creative self-motivation, sustainable, seminal, singular. Power is a temporary talent that deludes a debtor into behaving like a creditor, but energy is the lasting genius of a determined person, or people. Power finds you like a medicine, then leaves you like a drug. We could search for it forever because it expires the moment it's realized. But the more energy you use is the more you have. Power deceives and keeps its secrets in sewers. Energy is self-evident and can't be obscured but so long before it's written on the wall, for all to see.
Written on the wall, for all to see, America's energy problem is an existential crisis. We couldn't deny its relevance any more than we could deny the haunting architecture of happier days. If civilizations are known by their ruins, a society that's already generated so much waste can stop to consider itself in the dim but inevitable light of the future. Fragmented self-interest has always had a cancerous effect on one of the most complex organisms we know, society itself. As we search for energy, lethargy is a malaise of cellular origins. The concentrated personal energy of people living in closer quarters is poison to civic planners who encouraged life in the economically toxic market of single-family homes and suburbs, where the enthusiastic dissipation of food and energy is incubated. The ecological advantages of building up instead of out are little known in sprawling cities like Seattle, whose rates of home ownership are perennially number one in the nation, even among formerly segregated minorities. Energy costs are lower in collective living and working arrangements on account of the richer circulation of heat in taller buildings. Emissions and energy costs decrease with intensively localized access to and production of goods and services. And the civic imaginary has yet to dream of turbines and greenhouses that could turn skyscrapers into beacons of self-sustainability for consumptive American cities. There were times when towers were symbols of oppression to those who had reason to resent the United States in the world, in the hemisphere, or at home. If, in ambitious American architecture, skeptics only see the flawed triumph of business, it bears pointing out that economy and ecology share a common root, meaning life. The move from booms based on gambles, fads, and cultural fables is a move to better, more personal, more responsible business, community banks and community grocers, community entertainment, and community public works. Yes, in times of great optimism or Great Depression, the tendency has been to tempt history's heights. If Jimmy Carter was right, the kind of confidence it takes to scrape the skies remains an intangible requisite to a more energetic foundation of American life.
confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. Our people are losing that faith, not only in government itself, but in the ability as citizens to serve as the ultimate rulers and shapers of our democracy. Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. These changes did not happen overnight. They've come upon us gradually over the last generation. Years that were filled with shocks and tragedy. These wounds are still very deep. They have never been healed. We can regain our unity. We can regain our confidence. We're the heirs of generations who survived threats much more powerful and awesome than those that challenge us now. Our fathers and mothers were strong men and women who shaped a new society during the Great Depression, who fought world wars, and who carved out a new charter of peace for the world. We ourselves are the same Americans who just 10 years ago put a man on the moon. We are the generation that dedicated our society to the pursuit of human rights and equality. And we are the generation that will win the war on the energy problem. And in that process, rebuild the unity and confidence of America.
Practice peace and personal hygiene. Blazing trees until my eyes need rising. Two-stepping, all those other nice things. We like icing. Cooler water on your cold lemonade. Say, we lay stuff like we on your way to KK. Black diamond shining around with the lightning. We like icing. We like icing.
Icing like a Food Network with challenge slicing. The competition in half, nigga, cause my team. And we be sending them home, it's so frightening. And hater, you want, I'm inviting. Cause I'm doing just fine, I'm just Christing. I said I'm doing just fine, I'm just Christing. Like I just left church, nigga, I'm trying. Not to be a jerk, I'm inspiring. And at the top of the cake is where you find me. We like icing, we like icing. Just like the icing on the cake. These love vibrations I can shake. These pulse of revelation breathe in me. New desire, my destiny.
In the 1950s, sales guru Victor LeBeau began a movement to designate December 31st as Friendship Day. Asked about the placement of a contrived so-called holiday after the hallmark of the consumer calendar, LeBeau reportedly replied, If American business can get shoppers into stores for one more day after a long year of spending, it would be the icing on the cake.